It's late Monday afternoon, February 23rd, as I record this. Pardon me for being so lethargic, but we've just had a blizzard here in the Northeast, and there's way too much snow outside for me to take care of myself. That's why I hired a snow removal service, but because too many of their guys didn't show up, they can't come today. I thought I'd take the time to make a new video, but I'm not going to talk about secession. I'm actually going to talk about something completely different. About 4 years ago, I made a couple of videos about the 1978 Sergeant Pepper movie. And I got to thinking about it again recently because of Melania Trump's documentary, which I believe is now officially a flop. People were calling it a filmed bribe, which remind me of what Janet Maslin of the New York Times said about the Sergeant Pepper movie back in 1978. She said it was a filmed deal that was set to music. Same idea. Of course, there is a big difference between the Sergeant Pepper movie and the Melania Trump documentary. Contrary to popular wisdom, the Sergeant Pepper movie actually made money. It cost $13 million to make, which I'm sure was a lot more money then than it would be today. And it made $20 million at the box office. It was still considered a failure, though, because there wasn't really much of a profit. I think it barely broke even. But that's a whole lot better than what Melania Trump's movie has done. I think it only brought in $1 at the box office for every $10 it cost to make. And it cost $70 million to make. And in many ways, Melania is the Sergeant Pepper movie of documentaries. Most of the people who saw it hated it. The movie was produced by an insufferable, egomaniacal mogul. Robert Stigwood, of course, produced the Sergeant Pepper movie, and Jeff Bezos produced Melania. Some would argue that, like the Sergeant Pepper movie, Melania has a lousy soundtrack. And of course, the Sergeant Pepper movie soundtrack album was just a double album of mostly bad Beatles covers. Now, I confessed earlier that I actually liked the Sergeant Pepper movie when it first came out, when it first played in the theaters in the summer of 1978. I liked it so much I saw it the second time in the theaters. But of course, what happened was that I got the two Beatles albums that the movie drew most of its songs from, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band itself, and Abbey Road. And I'd never heard most of these songs before, as the Beatles had done them, but once I had had and heard these two albums, I didn't like the Sgt. Pepper movie as much as I did before, and after seeing it a third time on television, I decided that I didn't like it at all. Now, in fact, I hate it. I still can't get over how I was in middle school and thought the Sgt. Pepper movie is the best musical ever made. To go into high school and being like, what the hell was I thinking? So, of course, I've made it my life's work to encourage younger generations of Beatles fans not to see the Sgt. Pepper movie. I try to discourage, dissuade, and just plain stop people who are Beatles fans and haven't seen the Sgt. Pepper movie from seeing it, because I think it is that bad. Now, having said all that, there's some sad news that I originally heard a couple of years ago, but only recently have I found out that this news is in fact true. Back in late 2023 or early 2024, I read on social media that the singer-songwriter Sandy Farina, who played the girlfriend of the character in the Sgt. Pepper movie played by Peter Frampton, had died at the age of 68. There was no source of this information. There was no news story to confirm or corroborate this social media post from someone on Facebook, I believe. It might have been on Twitter, which had just become X. And late 2023 was about the time I quit the platform formerly known as Twitter. So, in other words, someone said that Sandy Farina had died, and I had no idea if it was true or not. Well, as a result of being prompted by Melania Trump's documentary into recalling the Sgt. Pepper movie, I did some digging. I Googled Sandy Farina's name, and I found a post that confirmed the news, and it was not a post from a newspaper or a news site like the Daily Beast or something like that. It was from a post from the Facebook account of Peter Frampton. Sure enough, Sandy Farina did die in November 2023, just before Thanksgiving, and Peter Frampton shared the news on his Facebook account. Now, I hadn't thought to look and see if Peter Frampton did have an account on Facebook to see if this news about Sandy Farina was true. I'd been stupid not to think of that. Because it turns out that even though the Sgt. Pepper movie did nothing for the career of either musical artist, Peter Frampton and Sandy Farina remained good friends in the decades that followed. And I'm sorry that I didn't think to check and see if he had a Facebook account. And it was a no-brainer that he would have had one. And see if this news was true. Now, here's the deal. In January of 1978, when shooting wrapped up or was winding down on the Sgt. Pepper movie, Sandy Farina was an unknown singer-songwriter. She would turn 23 a week before the movie opened. At the end of 1978, she was still an unknown singer-songwriter. The movie was credited for killing Peter Frampton's career, though it's more complicated than that. But the movie should be more correctly be credited for failing to give Sandy Farina a career of any consequence. Here's a brief rundown of how her career as a singer and songwriter went in the 45 years between the Sgt. Pepper movie's premiere and her death. She wrote or co-wrote a song for Barbra Streisand, Kiss Me in the Rain, which Streisand recorded. It's on her 1979 album, Wet. It's a concept album in which all the songs have to do with rain, wetness, water. And then Sandy Farina released an album of her own called All Alone in the Night. It didn't sell very well, and it went out of print almost immediately. She ended up singing jingles on commercials. And at one point in the 1980s, she appeared on Star Search. She did one of the most expensive, one of the most lavishly produced rock and roll musicals of all time. And then she was appearing on Star Search, which was like the prototypical American Idol. And it gets worse. I have in my hand the second edition of the Rolling Stone Record Guide, which came out in 1983. I'm looking this up right now. This is the review of the one album she recorded. Still looking for it, excuse me, please. And the review was written by the veteran rock critic Dave Marsh. Here it is. Pointless pop singer, docked 1 star for appearing in the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band movie. How many stars would Marsh have given Sandy Farina's All Alone in the Night album if she hadn't appeared in the Sgt. Pepper movie? 1. Which means he gave her album 0 stars. And he docked her a star just because she appeared in a movie that Dave Marsh probably hates even more than I do. He was a little kinder to the other little known female singer in the Sgt. Pepper movie, Diane Steinberg, who was also the daughter of legendary Detroit DJ Martha Jean the Queen, and that might be because Dave Marsh is from southeastern Michigan, and so would be a little bit kinder to anybody from Detroit. And I'm looking up in the first edition of the Rolling Stone Record Guide because Diane Steinberg's records went out of print by the time the second edition was issued. Therefore, she's only listed in the first edition. Part of the reason I bought the first edition was to get reviews on artists that were excluded from the second. Okay. Let me read what he wrote about Diane Steinberg. Okay. He only lists one album from her, though she recorded another album before that. The one album he did note is her 1977 album Universal Child, recorded on and released on ABC Records. ABC is now part of MCA. And here's what he wrote. How does the daughter of a Soul Queen disc jockey, Detroit's legendary Martha Jean the Queen, make a soulless pop record? Easy. She gets hooked up with a true mediocrity like David Pomeranz. Fortunately, Steinberg's first album, For Atlantic, was somewhat better. Unfortunately, but quite naturally, it's deleted. Her appearance in the Sgt. Pepper film ought to discredit her forever, though. So he gave Diane Steinberg's Universal Child album 3 stars out of 5, but still said it was soulless because this guy David Pomeranz produced it. Still, that's a whole lot better than the abuse he gave Sandy Farina. Yeah, I already told you in a previous video what Dave Marsh thought of the Sgt. Pepper movie and the Sgt. Pepper movie soundtrack. I'm not going to repeat it. You had to remember something about Dave Marsh. He's a bastard. I mean, I agree with the guy on some things, but where I disagree vehemently with him. I happen to believe that the Grateful Dead are a worthy musical act, and Madonna is the worst musical act in all creation. Dave Marsh thinks it's the other way around. Anyway, back to Sandy Farina. Yeah, there isn't much about her on the internet, really. And I'm surprised I was able to find out as much about her as I did. So here's what I did find out. She was born Sandra Feldman in July of 1955, and she was born and raised in Newark, New Jersey, which is in Essex County, where I'm from and where I still live. As you can gather from her maiden name, she was Jewish, and I presume she was from Newark's Weequahic section in the South Ward, which is where Newark's Jewish population mostly lived. There was a time when the South Ward of Newark Weequahic was pretty much all Jewish. Alan Klein was from Weequahic, and so was Philip Roth. So she met and married her husband, Michael Farina, before she did the Sergeant Pepper movie. As I recall from a People magazine article about her, this is actually a funny story. Her husband apparently is an artist, and he wanted to draw her picture. And according to this article in People magazine, he approached Sandra and asked her to model for him. And as she remembered, first they went out and then they got to know each other and then they got married. But Michael never bothered to actually draw her picture. Uh, yeah, that's a nice little anecdote there. This particular article in People magazine about Sandy Farina came out in the late summer of 1978 when it was already obvious that the Sgt. Pepper movie had been underwhelming, shall we say, at the box office. But the article was written with that acknowledgement while explaining Sandy Farina as an up and coming star and a singer to watch. And of course, that's not how it turned out. She clearly wasn't going to make it as an actress either. While making the Sgt. Pepper movie, she earned the unflattering sobriquet 16 Take Sandy because that's how many takes it took her to get through a single scene where all she had to do was close a door. Now, she was hardly the only person in the Sgt. Pepper movie who couldn't act. Frampton can't act, Barry Gibb can't act, his brothers couldn't act. Paradoxically, you had in the Sgt. Pepper movie actors who couldn't sing. Donald Pleasance couldn't sing, Frankie Howerd couldn't sing, George Burns could sing a little. He came from the old vaudeville tradition in showbiz where you had to do a little of everything on stage. As for Sandy Farina, well, she was primarily there to sing. I actually wrote an article about the Sgt. Pepper movie and how bad it was that I was able to get published in a now defunct Beatles fan magazine. And I'm not too proud of it. I got some of my facts wrong. Some of what I wrote was based on a misunderstanding of the facts, like how much money it took in and how many copies of the soundtrack album were sold. But the thing I most regret about this article is that I dismissed Sandy Farina rather cavalierly as someone who not only couldn't act, but couldn't sing. That was wrong. It was a little too nasty when I wrote that, and I regret what I wrote about her. Now, as for her performances in the Sgt. Pepper movie and on the Sgt. Pepper movie soundtrack album, Sandy Farina sang 2.5 songs in the movie. Here Comes the Sun, which, by the way, was the only George Harrison song used in this movie. Strawberry Fields Forever. Oh, and did I mention that Strawberry Fields was the name of her character? Mm. And the half song is When I'm 64, which she performed as a duet with Frankie Howard? Now, I have to be honest about Sandy Farina's vocal performances in the Sgt. Pepper movie. They were just terrible. And the problem was not her singing voice. She had a beautiful singing voice. That cannot be disputed. I want to make that clear. The problem was that her performances were doomed from the start because she was being asked to sing these Beatles songs based on arrangements that were as faithful as possible to the arrangements on the original Beatles records. And she was also being asked to sing songs that were woven together into the movie as part of a storyline that didn't make sense. And as a result, her vocals are very thin and lifeless. They sound phoned in. Her performance on Here Comes the Sun was very paint by number. She brought nothing new to the song. And quite frankly, the definitive cover of Here Comes the Sun was Richie Havens' 1971 recording, which had a very treble heavy acoustic guitar and heavy percussion. It's one of the most brilliant Beatles covers ever recorded. And Strawberry Fields Forever, it didn't even make sense for her to sing that song because that was her character's name. Don't ask me why. But as I said in the previous video, she's more or less singing, Let Me Take You Down because I'm going to myself. It doesn't jibe with anything going on in the movie. And she was expected to make it sound like it belonged in the movie and make it sound like she ought to be the one singing it. And of course, she was expected to sing it to an arrangement that was sort of like the original Beatles record. And Beatles fans know that the original Beatles recording of Strawberry Fields Forever took two different arrangements in two different keys and two different tempos, and took a piece of one and a piece of the other and joined them to create the master. This time, George Martin was trying to replicate the sound of the original master, and this time he didn't need to use any studio trickery. Neither did Jeff Emmerich, who had engineered the original recording and was now engineering this Sgt. Pepper movie cover. And besides, I can't imagine anyone covering Strawberry Fields Forever. That is one of those songs that should not be covered. One of those Beatles songs no one else should attempt to cover or remake, or however you want to say it. As for her duet with Frankie Howard, her singing partner is a comedian. And she's supposed to be singing about spending the rest of her life with him, even though his character kidnapped her character. I already covered that in the previous video. I mean, there she at least tries. On the lyrics she sings, she makes her lyrics sound almost operatic. But it still doesn't make sense for her to be singing to Frankie Howard because, first of all, as noted, his character has kidnapped her character. And second of all, he was a comedian. He couldn't sing. How bad was Frankie Howard at singing? There's this one lyric in When I'm 64 that goes, Sunday morning, go for a ride. The way Frankie Howard sang it sounded like, Sunday morning, go for a ride. I thought he was singing, The Girls Would Arrive. I heard that before I heard the original Beatles recording. When I heard the original Beatles recording, I thought, oh, go for a ride. Well, that makes more sense. In the movie, though, go for a ride didn't make any more sense than what I thought Frankie Howard was singing, Girls Will Arrive. Because in that particular scene, Frankie Howard and Sandy Farina were on a bus. They were already going for a ride. Of course, there were a lot of rides going on in the Sgt. Pepper movie. Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees ride on a hot air balloon, then they ride on a Learjet, then they ride in an open air limousine, then they ride in the open air limousine again, then they ride on a bus, then they ride in their hot air balloon again. Ultimately, it's the audience that gets taken for a ride. Now, having said all that, I'd like to direct your attention to a performance Sandy Farina gave on a German television show. She performed the song called Temptation in 1983 on this German TV show, and I assume the song was one of her original compositions. So I'm going to play an excerpt of that performance right now. So why don't we take a look at it, shall we?
Mit dem Titel Temptation.
When we're together, I knew it from
Now that's good. I like it. Admittedly, it's not rock and roll, it's pop. Early 80s pop, to be precise. But it was still pretty good for its time, especially when you remember that the 1980s was a very depressing decade for popular music. But yes, this is a good performance. This is a good song. And I hope to put up the full video of Sandy Farina singing this song sometime after this video is posted. I can understand why some people might not like it. Not because it's a bad song or Sandy Farina had a bad voice, but because some people might not necessarily like it from a stylistic standpoint. It's just not their style. That's perfectly fine. As for her style, it sort of reminds me of another pop singer from the 1980s that left this earth much too soon, Laura Branigan. Although Sandy Farina seems to have had a little more grit than Laura Branigan had, probably because of her New Jersey roots. Regarding any Sandy Farina content on the internet, well, you just find clips of some of her songs, mainly from her All Alone in the Night LP. That's in contrast to her co-star in the Sgt. Pepper movie, Diane Steinberg. You can find interviews with Diane Steinberg on numerous YouTube channels. She's very outgoing and she's always giving interviews on YouTube. And despite the fact that the Sgt. Pepper movie did not do well at the box office, Diane Steinberg has no regrets about having done it. And she's still active as a singer and as a musician. She plays keyboards. And she's also been active as a music teacher. And she's also married to Kenny Lee Lewis, the bass player for the Steve Miller Band. And she lives out in California with her husband. So she's had a pretty good life and she's not ashamed or regretful about having done the Sgt. Pepper movie. She considers herself a success. And of course, there's a big difference between success and fame. As it's been said before, Madonna is famous, Mother Teresa was successful, and there's a big difference. So, yes, Diane Steinberg is all over YouTube with all these interviews she's done. As for Sandy Farina, she apparently never did any interviews with anyone, be it on YouTube or on legacy television. I can only assume that she was a very private woman. But I do know this, again, from the interviews Diane Steinberg has granted on YouTube channels. She remained friends with Sandy Farina, and in the early 2020s, say 2020, 2021, she told one interviewer that Sandy Farina was still married to her husband, Michael, she had children, she had grandchildren, and she was doing fine as a jingle performer and a jingle writer. And from all accounts, Sandy Farina was as happy with her life post Sergeant Pepper movie as Diane Steinberg has been with hers. But as far as Sandy Farina herself saying that anywhere, I haven't found anything. Trust me, I looked. But again, she was obviously very private. I did find, though, one picture of her with another cast member of the Sergeant Pepper movie that she considered a friend, Peter Frampton. This is a picture of Sandy Farina with Peter Frampton at a party marking the end of filming on the Sergeant Pepper movie, with post-production and editing and all that bit to follow. And they clearly enjoyed each other's company. They became friends on the set of the Sergeant Pepper movie, as I noted earlier, and they remained in contact for years after. And it was good that Peter Frampton had friends like Sandy Farina and David Bowie. Bowie, of course, was his friend from childhood, and he helped Frampton get back on his feet after his career nosedived as a result of the Sergeant Pepper movie. And yeah, Bowie died in 2016, and now Sandy Farina's gone. And I'm absolutely certain that Peter Frampton was glad to have been friends with both of them. Yeah, well, I think I've said all I can possibly say about Sandy Farina. Um, it's a shame that her career never took off like it should have. But I think her widower and her children and grandchildren would agree that she still had a great life regardless. Nevertheless, she sort of reminds me of the B movie actress Roberta Collins, who was always trying to get out of the B movie grind, make it onto the A list, and she never did. And she quit acting after a career spanning 15 years. And never looked back after that. She was like a matron saint of unrealized ambition. I suppose you could call Sandy Farina the Roberta Collins of popular music. But I guess that would be unfair. It would be unfair to Sandy Farina because Roberta Collins had a lot of issues in her personal life that Sandy Farina never had. I think Roberta Collins would have been happy to have been as successful as Sandy Farina was. Again, just because Sandy Farina wasn't a household name before or after the Sergeant Pepper movie doesn't mean she didn't have a successful life. She obviously did. And, I guess I'll leave it at that. And if I have anything else to say about the Sergeant Pepper movie, I'll be back. No, that's not a Beatles song they used in the movie. I'm joking now. Well, I guess that's it for now. I'll return in some fashion. Bye.